Good evening, everybody, to our post-summer session. We begin this part of our Psychosocial Wednesday endeavor with Pia Skogemann. She is a Jungian analyst with private practice in Copenhagen, and she had her MA in religion, which we will see later on, I guess. And she's the author of numerous articles and books in Danish, and some are as well in English. Among them are Where the Shadows Lie by Chiron in 2009, The Double Conjunctio Tales in Copenhagen by Diamond, and The Double Conjunctio Tales by Diamond in 2013. And just this year coming out as in the anthology edited by Stefano Carpani, her paper she's talking about the Daughter Archetype. With the Daughter Archetype, or her Daughter Archetype, is a basic concept for, how should I put it, as a woman for herself, as a woman's self. So it has nothing to do with the mother archetype or the puella eterna. It's somehow which makes a woman, let's say. And I guess we will talk later to the corresponding sun archetype. And with that, I give over to Pia.
Thank you. Thank you. When I published my first book called Femininity in Growth already back in 1984, introducing for the first time the daughter archetype as a term for certain clinical phenomenology, I still thought that the concept could be, without ado, accommodated within the existing theoretical framework. But as I worked on it, however, I realized that it could not be done without a general revision of all our gendered concepts. My point is that none of our classical concepts is covering the establishment of an individual female identity. We have the natural family archetypes like the mother archetype, the father archetype, and we have the hero archetype in the place of the son, but there's nothing in the place of the daughter. So paradoxically, this absence of a daughter archetype is overshadowed by the huge preoccupation with the feminine. Jung generally describes all kinds of differences and opposites in the functions of the psyche in a symbolic way as masculine and feminine. He uses a gendered metaphor for the world, probably inspired by alchemy. It's not so strange. There must be at least two to constitute a space for differences, and the most basic symbol of meaningful differences is man and woman. We do live in a gendered world. Today in clinical practice, we often hear men and women referring to their feminine and masculine sides, and they kind of know what the masculine and the feminine are. One knows that the masculine is something about being active, dynamic, enterprising, productive, creative, and one knows that the feminine is something about being receptive, caring, capturing, affectionate, closer to psyche and nature. However, when analysts are presented with the statement, my masculine or my feminine sides, it is often coupled with a deep uncertainty about what it really means to be female or male, i.e. the subjective experience of psychological gender identity. The situation is actually the opposite of the one described by Jung when he formulated the theories of analytical psychology. I think at that time, both men and women were very sure what their gender roles were. But it is that cultural thing that has changed a lot. Jung himself wrote beautifully that psychological theories should not be dogma, but at best should serve as instruments of knowledge. What I try to focus on here is that this knowledge of masculine and feminine automatically informs our way of thinking and inhibits our ability to see something other than we expect. As I began to understand that this kind of knowledge blocked for fertile non-knowledge, I began to experience analytical processes with men and women who move from a position of knowledge of masculine and feminine combined with uncertainty about identity to a greater non-knowledge of masculine and feminine, but combined with a new and more secure sense of identity. Even though my ideas for a revision arose because of the theory concerning women, I realized that men often become just as limited by this standard knowledge of masculine and feminine. As a starting point for my review, it is important to accept that there are different kinds of differences. There are biological sex differences, male, female, historical, cultural, gender role differences, and psychologically experienced differences related to the gender identity and the relationship to the other sex, what we usually call masculinity and femininity. And finally, there are differences that are just differences and has nothing to do with either sex or gender. However, I do not believe that it is possible to get to definite truths about what these differences consist in, nor to distinguish them sharply from one another, nor do I think it's necessary. They are interacting systems, and recognition is itself limited by being in a particular historical situation. So instead of chasing truth about masculinity and femininity, it might prove more fruitful to turn our attention to the impressive capacity of the human psyche, the capacity to bring about the change for the sake of self-transformation. So my way towards a constructive revision is to keep the existing concepts, but to do away with the fixed gendered properties. That's the key. I wish first to look then at the four theoretical pairs of gendered concepts, which in reality, I would say, cover very different areas of psychological continuum. And we all know the four concepts. One, you have anima and animus. Two, you have the feeling and thinking function in the psychological typology. You have the two concepts, Eros and Logos. And you have finally the matriarchal and patriarchal consciousness. First, anima and animus. This conceptual pair is central to analytical psychology. Then, as now, analytical work must include visible personifications of masculine and feminine figures in dreams and fantasies of women and men, respectively, and they are associated with the pattern of affection reflected in the relations of men and women to each other in real life. When they appear in dreams or visions, anima and anima are naturally gendered, because so are psychic personification of living beings. They're usually marked by gender. Sometimes, however, the gender is uncertain, or there might be double-gendered figures. But I think it is important to maintain anima and animus as phenomenological terms, that it makes sense to talk about animus in a woman as if there was an inner man, but it's highly problematic to think that there is actually one, which even personifies predefined masculine properties. I prefer to open it up and just look at the context of these figures in both men and women, both the anima and the animus, instead of thinking ahead what they represent. a fairly common way of trying to correct the old bias among modern Jungians is to speak of animus and anima as expression of masculine and feminine principles acting equally in both sexes. I think that is the most frequent nowadays. But to me, the problem with this solution is that the symmetrical division of masculine and feminine properties are maintained, even reinforced. I would prefer to say that there seems to be a universal tendency to form gendered metaphors for the world. But on the one hand, the content of these metaphors changes over time, and on the other hand, it is not the least through critical, reflective, and unfinished efforts to distinguish metaphors from so-called truth, something we can remember maybe, the idea of biology as fate, which nobody or very few people believes in anymore. And in this context, the changes in the relationship between the sexes of our time has taken place. So I see animus and animus as basically clinical tools, as referring to unconscious phenomenology as it appears in dreams and projections, while feeling and thinking function refers to the way the conscious mind works. It is true that a feeling type woman will often have an animus that could be associated with thinking, as we have traditionally learned, because this would represent the more unconscious area. But for a thinking type woman, the reverse will probably be true, and vice versa for the man who has another typology than the thinking first. So I prefer to reserve the term anima for male fantasies about women and the feminine, and animus for female fantasies about men and the masculine. That was the first. Then Eros and Logos will be shorter. It's not so difficult. Jung formulated the concept of Eros as psychic relatedness and that of Logos as objective interest. But he nevertheless thought that women's psychology was founded on the first and men's on the second. But I see no reason that the concepts themselves should be gendered. And then we have third, the thinking and feeling. With this third gendered pair culminates the classical symmetry. We see an identification between the feeling, Eros, woman or anima, and the thinking, Logos, man or animus types. The thinking and feeling are only two of the four functions of consciousness in Jung's psychological typology. And though he himself lapses into describing the thinking type as he and the feeling type as she, there is no reasonable reason to persist in doing so. Indeed, statistical studies seem to show that there is no correlation between gender and the dominant function. So we come to the fourth pair, that is patriarchal and matriarchal consciousness. This pair of concepts originates from the Jungian analyst Erich Neumann. It involves a distinction between two different forms of consciousness, the first of which describe a so-called focused, active, goal-directed ego consciousness, while the latter describes a diffuse, receptive, so-called moon-like form of consciousness closer to the unconscious, says Neumann. The former is mirrored in the mythological sun hero, freeing himself from the embrace of the maternal and the unconscious, imaged in the early development of humanity and the individual child. Neumann further argues that the patriarchal consciousness in our culture has now become too dominant and must be complemented by the matriarchal one. Neumann's ideas has come to gain wide currency in post-Jungian literature, not least among women writers. his praise of the matriarchal consciousness, and his extensive use of myth as a mirror for psychological development appealed to many women's feelings that many aspects of being woman were overlooked or suppressed in a so-called patriarchal society or patriarchal psychology. Erik Neumann's quite popular notion of matriarchal versus patriarchal consciousness implied, however, the idea that then the ego is masculine in both sexes. He says it's only symbolic, but when coupled with such traditional gendered language, nothing can be only symbolic. And personally, I find it very unacceptable as a woman to think of my normal mental functions as masculine. I would say I'm a woman, therefore my ego is feminine. Some years ago, Professor Thomsen from the Danish Teacher Training College presented a study on gender role differences in kindergartens. The starting point was the fact that there is a clear difference between the behavior of preschool boys and girls. The boys play active, relatively violent games. The girls play quietly with dolls or like mommy-daddy things. Since most kindergarten teachers are women, Margit Thomsen wanted to find out if they discriminated against the children in a way that maintained traditional gender roles, which they did not, she saw. Her project had a clear feminist aim. She stated that she was tired of seeing screenshots of all the old men in charge, and she wanted to see more women and women's voices represented. The behavior of preschool boys and girls. The boys play active, relatively violent games, but the girls play quietly with dolls and mommy-daddy playing. Since most kindergarten teachers are women, Margit Thomsen wanted to find out if they discriminated against the children in a way that maintained the traditional gender role, which she found they did not. Her project had a clear feminist aim. She stated that she was tired of seeing screenshots of all the old men in charge, and she wanted to see more women and women's voices represented. There seemed to be an idea that this should be achieved by having girls activated in a way that was more like boys' behavior, since boys' behavior apparently results in them ending up in the most decision-making positions. Or to put it another way, the so-called masculine qualities would have to be added to the feminine ones, so to speak, in order to develop the self-confidence and trust in one's own thinking and creativity that are necessary for girls to excel. In the classical Jungian language, he was not a Jungian. The animus should be more developed. But this study reminded me of my own experience, which goes back to nearly 40 years back, as I observed a boy-girl situation in my daughter's kindergarten, very similar to the one described by Margit Thomsen. But this ended up making me thinking in a completely different way. At the time, this 40 years ago, I was not free from feminist concerns about my own daughter's absolutely typical girlish behavior and favorite pink colors and generally very gentle temper. But I wanted to know how she herself felt about the matter. So I said to her that I had noticed that the girls and boys did not play together much in the nursery, and that they played very different things, and what did she think was a difference between boys and girls. So I guess I expected that she at least didn't think there was anything less or worse about being a girl, but I didn't expect what she really answered. She said, "Girls are more clever than boys, because boys are so busy running around and making noise that they don't have time to sit and think and find out things and making things." So it was obvious that she focused on thinking and creativity as special girlish properties, which she was believed were better developed through the girls' behavior than through boys' behavior. It was actually a correct observation that girls in that age are generally more cognitively developed than boys. But it is perhaps an example of when you already know what is feminine and what is masculine, because girls' play are thought to develop feminine virtues like nurturing, mothering, empathy, etc. And the fact that the other people maybe devalue girlhood as not being conducive to later skills of thinking, creativity, etc., is perhaps one of the reasons why girls either lose confidence in their capacities in such areas or come to understand these capacities as masculine rather than an attribute of their own girlhood and femininity. For many women, it is more important to be feminine than to be clever, if clever also mean unfeminine. So after a lot of thinking and this revising I've gone through with you, it becomes possible to extend the theory with a concept that is especially applicable to women, namely the daughter archetype. I should perhaps add, because of Bernard's early remarks, that there is already a son archetype. We have many son. We have the hero. We have the poor. We have many son images for the son archetype. But when I speak of the daughter archetype, it's to emphasize a difference from the mother archetype in the psyche of woman. The phenomenology of the daughter archetype is represented at all levels of psychic functioning. The images range from ego representations to godlike self-representations. The notion of the daughter archetype addresses the female psyche, but does not define the feminine as such. And I will name shortly 3 levels. First, the developmental level. In the normal development of girls, one can see the imagery of the daughter archetype unfolding in the plays, dreams, and heroines which small girls may indulge in, from the early pink princess fantasies playing with Barbie dolls, or listening to the story perhaps of the strongest girl in the world, the Swedish Pippi Longstocking, or lots of other fairy tales or stories. In the analysis of adults, images of the daughter archetype will often meditate aspects of the self which should be made conscious and integrated in the female personality to serve the female individuation process. Insofar, they would tend to support the differentiation from both traditional gender roles and from identification with the anima projection from men. They support the development of ego consciousness and its growing autonomy. The differentiation between the mother archetype and the daughter archetype is very important for women, just like the differentiation of the anima from the mother archetype is for men. The next level we can call everyday level. By this, I mean the socially recognized gender roles for young women whose symbolic dimensions are not visible before they are looked at critically and are loosened from their absoluteness in traditional cultures. On the individual level, they are often identified equally with the persona or with the projections of the anima from men. But with greater social freedom in their upbringing, young women today have multiple choices from their style of life, their education and profession, their relationship with other women and with men. This makes a great difference from the lack of freedom of choice of earlier generations. The daughter archetype is also, and that's the third level, the archetypal level, is richly represented in the history of symbols, as in mythology and fairy tales. Jung himself did actually discuss one version of the archetypal daughter in his article, The Psychological Aspect of the Cora. It's in volume 9.1. Jung states that the figure of the Cora belongs to the Anima archetype when observed in a man, and in a woman to the supraordinate personality, meaning the archetype of the self. But when you look at the myth, I suppose you probably all know the myth about the denominator and Cora. But when you look at the very passive abducted Cora type, however, it corresponds, I think, to a conservative gender role and, or, in my view, a poorly developed ego. In the Greek myth, the entire feminine agency is held by the mother goddess Demeter. And Jung comments like this in his article: "These maidens," says Jung, "are always doomed to die because they only glitters and they are childish forms of the self." He doesn't see any developmental forms between this passive style and the more mature. So a presentation of the Sumerian goddess Inanna will serve as an illustration of a very different archetypal daughter figure. Her title in the Sumerian era actually was Daughter of the Gods. She alone, among the many Sumerian gods, had no divine spouse. Everybody else has, but not she. She was for maybe 2,000 years the divine maiden. So, though certainly not in the virgin way. Actually, the Sumeric language had no word for virgin, only a concept like not yet sexually experienced. Only later in the Babylonian era, she was transformed into a mother goddess. My own work on Inanna was based on the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, an internet-based project from Oxford University with a lot of scientific translations, about 400 Sumerian texts, among them quite a lot about Inanna. It was a huge project which has kind of stopped. I think it lost funding or something, which is a sad thing. Very few people in this world are specialists in reading and understanding the Sumerian clay tablets and also collecting them together and finding the stories. So discoveries of new fragments have often altered older translations of a text considerably. Anyhow, Inanna was the daughter of the moon god Nanna, who is masculine in Sumerian, but also the moon goddess Ningal, but she is very in the background. And she was sister to the sun god Utu. She herself in the celestial aspect was Venus. And from Venus she borrowed her ever-changing nature. She is often associated with the horn, which does not originate from the moon, but from the sickle of Venus. Like the moon, Venus has phases. And so when Venus is on the sky closest to Earth, has a sickle like the new moon. But then the light is the most strongest. During the conjunction with the Earth, either further or far conjunction, Venus changes from evening star to morning star. This is probably, it is away from the sky some days, and this is probably the astronomical background of the famous myth of Inanna's descent to the underworld, which is the oldest story known of a descent to the underworld. Many of Inanna's attributes were such as we traditionally ascribe to men or to the masculine. She was aggressive ambitious, assertive, autonomous, and authoritative, but she was always attractive and seen as the essence of femininity, since she was the goddess of love and sexuality. Inanna is the main figure in many love songs, with Dumuzi the shepherd. Sometimes he's a mortal. He is sometimes identified with the priest king of Uruk as a chosen spouse. Interestingly, according to a Sumerian expert, in the ancient Sumerian world, the phallus represented fertility and the vulva represented sexual potency, just the opposite of what we are accustomed to. Inanna's lush gardens were a sophisticated meeting place for lovers. The garden's flowers and vegetables are often used as metaphors for the sexual organs and the erotic play itself, which is a very sophisticated thing compared with the so-called primitive fertility rites. It has actually nothing to do with it. She was sexually broad-minded too. In that sense, she suddenly seems very modern. Prostitutes, homosexuals, hermaphrodites, and transsexuals were under her protection. Her power of creativity showed, especially in all things belonging to a civilization, language, music, and the song of power, in all sophisticated handicraft, and in the art of love. But she was also goddess of war. She would rage wildly if offended and lead the battle against her enemies like a fire-spouting dragon or wild leopard, and she would lead the king in battle and bring victory to her favorites. She had a lust for expanding her power dominance. It was without boundaries, and one can follow it in her myths, but she often succeeded it. But when she traveled to the underworld, it was with the intention of taking the throne of the underworld from the goddess Ereshkigal and make it an addition to her domains of heaven and earth. But there she finally met her limit. She was killed, and her corpse was hanging on a hook for 3 days. So that's the traditional 3 days in the underworld dead. But thanks to her own precaution, her female helper and the god Enki managed to bring her back to life, where she had to accept some big changes, which I don't need to go into here. So I hold my tongue here and think I have kind of made my point.
Okay, thank you, Pia. Coming back to the sun archetype.
Yes.
What you said, let's talk about, the Pura Eternus, you have the female version as well, the Puella, and the others are more certain aspects. And as far as I understood what you are trying to achieve with...
you have the hero archetype, basically.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, which is a model for the ego.
So are you saying that the hero archetype is similar to the daughter archetype?
I think it is the daughter archetype also serves as a model or archetypal background for the female ego. That's my point.
Yeah. We
are so used to think of the hero as that.
Yeah. I'm just beginning to see that the man is the hero and the feminine is
the Anima.
And okay, that makes sense. Okay, thanks for clarifying. And it's the question is why you said the core Jung came up with it a little bit, but one can say the psychoanalysts were much more focusing on men and as on women. especially Freud. There I have a first question. The first question is from Madhuri Marelli. She asks, the female heroes are Athena and Artemis?
Yes. Athena is, as you know, born from the head of Zeus. And she has, there's a important problem in that she likes, well, they are daughter goddesses. They are not mother goddess. If you say there's a difference between mother goddesses and daughter goddesses, Artemis and Athena, of course, is daughter goddesses.
Mm. Okay, any further questions? I hope your topic was not too new to everybody here.
If I can ask a question, Pia.
Yeah.
I was going to type it in, but it was taking me too long. Neumann.
Yeah.
Admittedly, Neumann is very male-oriented in all of his work, of course. But when he talks about Psyche and Eros, he'll characterize Psyche as going through her many adventures, and then right near the end, she collapses in despair and has to be rescued by Aphrodite.
Yes.
Which
by Eros.
Oh, all right. I thought at one point Aphrodite actually helps her near the end of the myth, but I might be wrong.
She became unconscious because he opens this box.
Yes.
And he came to her rescue and wakes her with a pin of her, you know, the arrow.
Yes.
With an arrow.
But in the late part of the myth, near the end of it, there is a relationship between the mother and Psyche as heroine, as hero. I shouldn't even say heroine. Now, is that really a male projection, or is that of any use? Would that be too limited for what you're talking about?
It is interesting in that part of the late part of the story where Psyche becomes unconscious and has to be saved by Amor. As I recall it, Neumann actually says, and thanks God she can't do it by herself, because then she would be taking a masculine path. And so he thinks it's very, very good that she doesn't have any agency herself. And she doesn't, because she's helped. She constantly wants to kill herself and is saved by different animals or nature features. But you know, it's a very widespread pattern of from fairy tales, as the Beauty and the Beast pattern. It is very old. It's several thousand years old. Some researchers have kind of, you know, tracked with the help of language archaeology the age of fairy tales, and this pattern is one of the oldest, and it does not always have this kind of passive main person, female person. There's several Scandinavian versions, for instance, one called the Ice Bear King Valemon, where the heroine goes out for herself to try to track him and succeeds. And is not sort of as less feminine because of that.
Okay, Paul? Another question from Madhuri. How are you differentiating the archetype from the female identities as in fairy tales, myths, and real presentations of women in culture and breaking away from the traditional? Are these all daughters and or mother archetypes?
Yeah, I must have the question again. In fairy tales, what you would call the main female leading person, I would say, is a representative of the daughter archetype, because they are always young. They probably meet mother figures in the fairy tale, but who has the protagonist? If it is a woman's tale, is a woman, and this I would call the daughter representative of the daughter archetype.
Then there's a question from Drake. Please say more about the psychological dual role reversal of Persephone as both above-world daughter and underworld wife.
Well, we don't know much about it, because what we hear about is that Cora returns to be embraced by Demeter, who is very, very happy, and she brings also a son. She has given birth to a son, and it is very associated with the Eleusinian mysteries, where we really never have been informed of what was going on. But I think we are not informed. We can guess, but we are not informed about what is happening down in the underworld with her, except that she has eaten a seed and thereby got pregnant. But I think what I'm thinking about is that the whole story has Demeter as the main protagonist. It is she who has the agency. It is she who kind of presses the male overgods to bring her back, to bring her daughter back, because she has the power to stop the growth on Earth, which is a great power to have. So all the agencies with the mother.
There's a question by Shmuel Bernstein, but I can't unmute him. Paul, can you do that?
Yes, I can tell you. I'm a member of OFEC organization in Israel, which is we are doing workshops, group relations workshops on the Tavistock model. We were invited to make such a workshop in the business administration school in Tel Aviv University. And all the participants were women that are going to be the chief of human resources in many organizations. So
yes,
I confronted them as stop being Shone Mädchen, because they try to be very nice daughters, very compliant. And I confronted them, you must be more assertive and don't be such Shone Mädchen. And it works very, very well, because they become more assertive after this work.
Sounds good.
Schöne Mädchen, yeah.
Schöne Mädchen, yeah.
Any more questions? Come on, guys. Paul asks, would you want any figures between daughter and mother? And yeah.
What do you mean?
Paul, what do you mean by figure?
No, what do you mean by figures between mothers and daughter?
Yeah, I'm asking.
And men, of course. I think the normal quaternity is father, mother, son, and daughter. So of course it's important. This has also something to do, I think I also talked about that this has very much to do with the relationship to men, inner men and outer men.
I suppose I'm also wondering about, this may be too modern to treat it archetypally, but an assertive female, or for that matter, male figure who is not part of a family structure. Would you want to look for that, or is that not very useful, perhaps?
I think all these figures are part of a family structure somehow. You cannot not be a son or a daughter. You can perhaps escape being a father or mother if you don't have any children, but then you would have inner counterparts. Also, if you are childless in real world, you will still have lots of children in your inner world and in your dreams. So it's impossible not to be part of a family structure.
That's an interesting point. There's a question from Ruth Clausen. Sometimes women go from being coached to be more assertive, to becoming more like imitation men, and that doesn't seem to work out well.
No, but I'm not talking about imitating men, but finding your own agency, which is different.
Yeah. I don't see any more questions, so shall we call it a day?
Yes.
I must say, I find it quite touching what you are saying, for a reason I can't say why. Yes, I guess you touched something I haven't experienced or thought of before. Thanks.
Yeah. You don't happen to be a feeling type man?
I'm an intuitive kind of man.
Intuitive, because that's the men in my practice who has been most affected by this different way of watching it, because suddenly not all the intuitive or feeling abilities belongs to the anima, but could be natural part of your own ego as a man, which is just as important, I think, as what I have talked about with the woman. And especially feeling type and intuitive men, and especially introverted types of these functions doesn't fit into the normal masculine scheme. And there's a lot of suffering with that. So maybe that was what hit you.
Ruth asking again, can you say more about those inner children?
Well, it's clinical observation. They arrive in dreams or fantasies, or if you do active imagination, you may counter inner children. We often look at the inner children as, new possibilities. Of course, could also be childishness, something that you're still a child and react like a child. But the other thing, the more archetypal version, it could be, the growth, like the hero or heroine from the myth is left abandoned or have unknown potentials. Maybe you in dreams encounter a child, who are baby but can talk and can react, and things like that. That is a bit outside the realistic properties of a baby.
Now a couple of typical archetypal questions are coming in. There's one from, I hope I read it correctly, Cornelia Yashenko. How does a negative daughter complex look like?
A negative daughter complex?
Yeah.
That could be like any negative complexes. If it's rigid, or it possesses you, or you are armed constantly against the motherly, or the masculine or men, it could be negative.
And in a similar direction, Madhuri asks, first thing that comes to my mind would be a wounded daughter. Is that correct?
Yeah. I think one of our Jungian writers wrote about the wounded. How was it? Can anybody recall the title? Very old book from the 80s about the various wounds that would be in a women's makeup. You know, like protecting too much, or be the wounded Amazon or something. So there's a lot of wounds, like with anything else. That's not different.
The Wounded Woman.
The Wounded Woman, yeah.
By Linda Leonard.
Yes.
Okay. Then we close it here, and all I have to do is announce the next meeting on 12th of October. That will be with Mary Watkins, and she will talk about individuation, ancestral reckoning, and eco-psychosocial repair. Pia, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we will come back to you by mail very soon for a certain question. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.